There's a moment in every great story where the hero is on the ground, where the rain is falling on him, where the jungle is silent, where everything he was is covered in mud. And the only thing left is the question of whether he gets up, not whether he can. He can that. The question is whether he decides to. Come decided. What happened next changed Skull Island forever. Title fades slowly. Film begins.
The night had no stars, not a single one. The sky above Skull Island was a sheet of black so deep and so complete that even the moon seemed afraid to show its face. The trees stood like ancient sentinels, their massive roots curling into the earth like the fingers of buried giants. And the air was so thick with moisture that every breath felt like swallowing the jungle itself. Somewhere deep in the swamp, something was moving. Not with the careless noise of an animal searching for food, not with the clumsy stumbling of a creature lost in the dark. This was the movement of something that knew exactly where it was going. Something old, something patient, something that had been waiting for a very long time. The water barely rippled as it moved beneath the surface. The mud parted for it the way a crowd parts for a predator, slowly, reluctantly, with fear pressed into every inch of the movement. Bubbles rose to the surface and popped without sound, releasing a smell like rotting wood and ancient rain, and things that should have stayed buried. The trees on the edge of the swamp leaned away as though they could feel what was coming. Even the insects went silent. Every cricket, every frog, every small living thing that made the jungle sound alive, all of them stopped at once, as if they had received a signal that no human ear could hear. A warning broadcast on some frequency older than language, older than thought. Then it came. It rose from the swamp the way a nightmare rises from sleep. Not all at once, but in pieces. First, the shape of a shoulder, massive and dripping, covered in something between moss and muscle. Then the outline of a head, broad and low, with eyes that caught no light because there was no light to catch, and yet somehow glowed anyway, a dull and terrible amber that pulsed like the heartbeat of something that should not exist. Its arms were long, grotesquely long, and they dragged through the water as it rose, trailing strands of swamp weed and black mud that fell from them like old skin. It had no neck to speak of. Its head sat directly on the mass of its body, and its mouth, when it opened, revealed not teeth, but something worse. A darkness inside a darkness. A void that seemed to go back forever. This was the Bog Monster. This was the thing that even Skull Island's oldest creatures spoke of only in movement and instinct, never in sound. It had no name that any living thing had given it. It had simply always been there, in the deepest part of the swamp where the water never dried and the sun never reached, waiting with the endless patience of something that understood time differently than everything else. It did not think the way other creatures thought. It did not feel hunger the way other creatures felt hunger. What drove it was something more fundamental than any of that. A need to take, to consume, to cover everything in the same darkness and silence that it came from. And tonight, it had taken something it should never have touched. Tonight, it had come for the king. The sound that followed was not a roar. It was not the kind of sound you expect from a fight. It was the sound of something being broken that was never meant to break. A deep, tearing crash that moved through the jungle like a shockwave, bending the tall grass flat and sending birds screaming into the dark sky in every direction. It was the sound of Kong hitting the ground. He had not fallen like a tree falls, stiffly and with warning. He had been thrown. One moment he had been standing at the edge of his territory, chest wide, eyes alert, reading the jungle the way he always read it, with absolute authority, with the confidence of something that has never truly been threatened. And then the swamp had exploded around him and something had wrapped around his legs and pulled, and the ground had come up to meet him with a violence that shook the entire island. His massive fists had hit the earth and sunk into it. Mud had sprayed in the circle around him like a crown thrown into the dirt. He pushed himself up. His arms shook. Not from weakness. Kong had never been weak. But from the shock of it. From the specific and unfamiliar sensation of being hit by something that he had not seen coming, had not prepared for, had not had the chance to face with the fullness of his strength. He turned, and the Bog Monster was already there, already moving, faster in the dark and the wet than anything that size should have been able to move. It hit him again before he could fully rise, and this time the impact was different. This time it was not just physical. This time something in the collision carried with it the weight of the swamp itself, the cold heaviness of deep water, the suffocating pressure of mud that pulls you down and holds you and does not let go. Kong fought. Of course he fought. He was not the kind of creature that accepted anything without resistance, and the fire in him was real and fierce and ancient. He reached out and grabbed what he could grab, and his hands found something between arm and tentacle, something that was both solid and shifting, and he pulled and twisted with everything he had. He heard something that might have been pain from the monster, or might have been the sound of the swamp adjusting to accommodate what was happening in it. And for a moment, he felt the grip loosen. For a moment, he was almost free. But the swamp was the monster's territory in a way that Skull Island had never fully been Kong's. Kong had inherited his kingdom. The Bog Monster had grown from its. Every root in that swamp was connected to it in ways that went beyond biology. The mud responded to it. The water obeyed it. And so when Kong finally broke free and stood and roared into the sky, that enormous, world-filling sound that had always been the final word on every question ever asked in this jungle, the monster simply waited. It let Kong roar. It let him beat his chest. It let him declare himself. And then it rose again from the swamp, taller this time, wider, as if it had used the brief pause to pull more of itself together from the deep places where it stored its mass. And it came at Kong not with the wild fury of an animal, but with the slow and terrible certainty of a disaster. Kong went down a second time, and then a third. Each time he rose, and each time the rising cost him something. A little more breath, a little more blood from the wounds opening across his arms and shoulders, where the monster's edges had cut him. A little more of that absolute certainty that had always been his most powerful weapon. Because Kong had never doubted himself. That was the truth at the core of him. He was not brave because he had overcome fear. He was something beyond that, something that had simply never needed to construct the idea of fear in the first place. But tonight, on the floor of the swamp with mud in his eyes and the monster's weight pressing down on him from above, something new entered his experience. Not fear exactly, but the shadow of it, the possibility of it, the knowledge that things did not always go the way they were supposed to go. He managed to drive the creature back one more time. He got his feet under him and pushed with everything that remained in him, and the monster retreated into the water, and Kong stood alone on the bank, chest heaving, blood mixing with the mud on his fur, one eye half closed from a wound above his brow. The jungle around him was completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of a king at rest in his domain. The terrible silence of a place that has witnessed something it cannot process. Something that has broken one of the assumptions the world was built on. Kong had lost. He did not understand it at first. He stood there breathing, waiting for something to resolve, for the moment to make sense in the way that moments had always made sense to him, with him standing and everything else fallen. But the swamp was still, and the monster was gone back into its depths, and the jungle was still silent, and Kong was alone with wounds that he had never had before, and a heaviness in his chest that had nothing to do with physical damage. He had been pushed back. He had been beaten in his own territory. He had been made to understand, for the first time in his existence, that there was something in this world that did not recognize his authority. He moved away from the swamp slowly, not retreating, that word did not exist in him, but withdrawing, in the way that a storm withdraws before it rebuilds itself into something larger. He moved to higher ground, to the rocky ridges above the tree line where the rain came hard and clean and cold, and he sat with his back against the oldest stone on the island and let the rain wash the blood and mud from him, and he was still for a long time. The island around him changed in the days that followed. This was the thing that mattered most, the thing beyond the physical fact of his defeat. The jungle's balance, which had always organized itself around Kong's presence the way planets organize themselves around a sun, began to shift. Other creatures moved differently. The smaller predators that had always kept their distance from his territory began to press at its edges, testing, probing, responding to some signal in the air that told them the certainty they had always lived within was no longer entirely certain. The Bog Monster's influence spread from the swamp outward, slowly, the way cold spreads from an open window. Not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, in a way that changed the temperature of everything it touched. And Kong felt all of it. He felt it the way you feel weather in a wound, not through thought, but through the body, through instinct, through the deep and wordless knowing that lives below consciousness in creatures old enough to have accumulated that kind of intelligence. He felt the shift in the jungle's orientation, the small daily evidence that his world was realigning itself around a different center. And something in him that had been still and confused and heavy began to change. The heaviness did not leave him, but it transformed. It stopped being the weight of defeat and became the weight of intention. It stopped pulling him down and started pressing him forward. He began to move through the jungle differently. Where before he had moved through it as an owner moves through his property, casually, confidently, without particular attention, now he moved through it as a student moves through a subject he is determined to master. He went to the edges of the swamp and he watched. Not from far away, not from the safe distance of a creature uncertain of what it is watching, but close. Close enough to smell the specific rot of it. Close enough to study the way the water moved and what the movement meant. Close enough to understand the swamp not as a hostile foreign territory, but as a system, a set of patterns, a language that could be learned. He watched the way the Bog Monster moved through its domain. He watched the way it used the water and the mud not just as an environment, but as extensions of itself. The way it pulled strength from the deep places. The way it became more formidable the deeper into the swamp the confrontation went. He watched, and he remembered, and he did something that was perhaps the most remarkable thing about